Welcome to the Forest Analytics Landing Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Russell. In this podcast, we'll talk about how data and analytics are transforming the forest products industry. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. Today, I want to talk about timberlands and investments. Now, if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you'll know that last year at about this time of year, I had a similar episode talking about the rise of timberlands as investments. And this year, I'm going to be talking about basically the same topic with some newer data that came out from 2022. And one of the great data sources that really is tracking the investments in timberlands is some data from the National Council of Real Estate Investment Fiduciaries. And they're a group, they work and they kind of monitor what's going on in investments in land and real estate in a number of different sectors. And obviously the one focus on timberlands is one that many of us in forestry are often looking at. And so to summarize, they kind of put this data set out there with some information that they gather from various land transactions across the year. And so what they call their Timberland Index is brought out every year. And so this index represents almost 500 different investment grade timberland properties across the United States, and the total market value is almost $25 billion. And so it's just an incredible, a great source to be looking at timberlands as investments and to really track that over time. And as best as I can find, I've found the data for this Timberland Index going back all the way to 2010. And so we can begin to pull out some trends, particularly as we compare it to other things, other economic measures, particularly as economies fluctuate, go up and down. We can kind of see where timberlands fall within those different categories within the economy. And so if you look at the Timberland Index for 2022, it gained almost 13%, which is the largest annual increase, at least since the data that I've found, going back to 2010. And so that's just an incredible amount of growth. You know, when you think about the stocks, the S&P went down nearly 20%. If you look at the S&P 500, down 20% in 2022. Well, for something to be going up by 12% is a great thing to have as a part of your portfolio. And so just the incredible rise of timberlands as investment continuing to be performing so well in the economy, I think is something that many of us that deal with managing land, if you're involved in transactions of real estate, that's just an incredible value and a good thing for forests and for timberlands to be shown in that light, given what's been going on in the U.S. economy. And so one of the things that I like to always do is just to kind of see how this Timberland Index is performing relative to some of those other economy-wide measures. And so what I've done in a blog post I published here last month, which I'll link to in the show notes, is I've plotted basically the trends from 2010 to 2022 of the Timberland Index relative to some of the other economic-wide measures. So I plotted that against the 10-year Treasury and the S&P 500, the annual returns from those. And what you can see is that back in 2010, timberlands as investments were really kind of filtering around zero. There wasn't much return on timberlands. It kind of goes up to about 2014, then goes down a bit. Then right as the pandemic started in 2021 really was the first year we really saw that Timberland Index rise. So it's just about 9% last year, and then again this year being close to 13%. And so what you see there is that obviously that trend in the Timberland Index is generally always positive. Which is good to see here, at least looking at the last 12 years. If you look at the last 13 years, the Timberland Index has averaged a return of 5.2%. And again, that line is relatively flat relative to some of these other economic-wide measures. And so if you look at something, one of the values that I really like when I look at data is the coefficient of variation. And so that takes not into account not only the mean value, but also the standard deviation or some measure of the variability of the different values that have been compiled over a time series. And so in this case, the variability of returns in the Timberland Index is actually lower than returns from the S&P 500. So if you look at the coefficient of variation for the Timberland Index, it's almost 83% compared to the S&P 500, where it's over 100%, 133% for the S&P. And so obviously with the S&P and the stock market in general, even if you include all the up and down years in the last 13 years, the average return from the S&P 500 is about 10.9% compared to the Timberland Index of 5.2%. But the Timberland Index is much more stable. That is, it doesn't have as much variation across years relative to S&P 500 and many of the stock classes that are a part of that index. And so this kind of gives the impression that Timberlands are usually a pretty good bet because they generally always have a positive return, and their variability in the returns from year to year is much lower than if you were to invest in stocks as represented by the S&P 500. A little bit more data about that Timberland Index report from this group that produces it. I think it's important to look too at the different regions that it reports on. And so when you look at the different regions, if you look at the Lake States, the Southern U.S., Pacific Northwest, and the Northeast, they also have property values per acre for timberlands. And so if you look at the different regions, actually the Lake States region, which tends to have the lowest property values for timberlands, actually increased the most, up about 7% to a value of about $673 per acre compared to what it measured in the third quarter in 2022. And so that's a tremendous increase there. In the southern U.S., it's about $2,009 per acre was their market value for timberlands. Pacific Northwest, about $2,900 per acre. And in the Northeast, about $1,500 per acre. And these are compiled again on those almost 500 different properties across the United States that they've been tracking as a part of this index. So I think it's important to recognize and to just understand the importance of this asset class, not only if you're an investor and you want to invest in timberlands, but to get a sense of, if you manage lands, if you're a forester and you're out there managing lands, that timberlands as an asset class are valued within the investment community. And of course, folks that work with organizations like timber investment management organizations and real estate investment trusts, they certainly recognize that. But I also think it's important for all of us to recognize that, especially now as forests have a lot more attention to them when it comes to whether it be forest carbon markets, whether it be natural climate solutions, they're valued, and especially valued here in terms of them as an asset class, them as an investment that folks like to have as a part of their portfolios. So I'll link to the post that kind of describes this along with some other resources that highlight timberlands as investments.
Thanks for listening to the Forest Analytics Landing Podcast. For more information on how data and analytics can empower your organization, visit arbor-analytics.com.